Good day to you. Over the weekend, I was just amazed at the number of people on my Facebook feed who were posting that they were staying up to watch the royal family's wedding, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. Okay, now, if you're looking at my face right now, you can probably tell that I have an opinion about the wedding. And you may even guess that I have an opinion about the royal family. Why is that? That's because I'm indicating to you with my face that it's something that I find, if you read it this way, to be kind of distasteful. The royal family, the royal wedding. Yeah, I just kind of have a hard time with the royal family and how much money it makes, and really the idea of royalty all overall in comparison with how many poor people there are in the world. And especially when I see a gun shooting occurring in Texas, and then I see a royal family celebration and all the amount of attention that's paid to that, it just seems out of whack to me. So why am I starting class with this today? It's because it's an example of nonverbal communication, my facial reaction. And you're already learning from the way that I feel about this particular incident by my facial expression before I've even said words. But the thing is, you don't really know the extent of my quote distaste for the royal family. And that's because one of the very early points in this book, it comes out of the research of Burgoon and Sane, and their research says that nonverbal communication is analogic. It's analogous. It's analogic. It's not digital. What does that mean? It means that when we talk about verbal communication, that is a form of discrete communication. If you ask me whether you have the red light or the green light to go forward, and I say green light, that's pretty clear. You can go forward. It's discrete. If you ask me how many potatoes you want me to pick up at the store, and I do this, that's nonverbal communication, and it is discrete. But if I say two at the same time, then I'm making it definitely discrete. So nonverbal communication can be digital, it can be discrete, but most of it is analogic, meaning that you don't really know the intensity or the specificity of the feelings and the thoughts and the behaviors that are behind the nonverbal communication, as you don't really know the extent of my distaste for the royal family. So let's talk about nonverbal communication. And we know that some of nonverbal communication is biological. Darwin did a lot of research on that. You can decide for yourself how much you agree with this. We can think about, for example, the smile. Is the smile just something that we naturally do when we're happy? Are there cultures that do this when they're happy? Or is it something that's biological? It's built into us. We know how to do it before we're taught to smile. Or is the smile learned? I mean, it's both, isn't it? Right? If I ask you if you want somebody to take your photo, or if you take your own selfie, many times, if not most times, you're smiling because you're an American. But doesn't mean you're happy. You could be having the most miserable day in the world, but you smile for that selfie and then put it on Instagram. Whereas Germans, for example, as the book points out, they're not smiling as often. But does it mean that they're less friendly than people who are living in the United States? So nonverbal communication is both biological and it's also something that we learned. So what is nonverbal communication? Well, I actually disagree with the definition in this book. The definition in this book is nonverbal communication is the intentional use of a the intentional use of a non-spoken symbol in order to communicate a purpose. The problem that I have with that definition is in the word intentional use. Because nonverbal communication is not always intentional. Sometimes you're communicating nonverbally and you don't even, like I'm doing now. My arms are crossed. Am I cold? Am I not open to somebody else's ideas? Is my back hurting? It could be any and all of these things, but I'm still communicating nonverbally, but it's not necessarily intentional. At any rate, really what we're talking about here is any kind of communication other than the spoken word. So let's talk about the functions of nonverbal communication. A lot of this material dovetails with material that we teach in our Intro to Communication course, CMST 111, so it should be fairly familiar to you. And once again, this chapter is set up where we have a lot of concepts that are laid out, and then at the end, there's a couple case studies in specific cultures to illustrate these concepts. So let's talk about the functions now of nonverbal communication. Why do we have nonverbal communication no matter what our culture is, no matter where we live in this world? Why do we all have different forms of nonverbal communications? Because nonverbal communication performs different functions. So function number one is replacing spoken messages. Replacing spoken messages. And we have two types of nonverbal communication that are laid out here that help express replacing spoken messages. One is the sign. A sign is a very specific visual that we've come to understand means something. Like when you see that red octagon on a street corner, you know right away that means stop. And that's very universal. You'll find that same stop sign all over the world. Wouldn't it be unfortunate to have something like a stop that's a triangle in China that's red, and over in Azerbaijan it's a blue oval? No, that wouldn't work. It's so important. It's so vital that you stop at an intersection, because if you don't, you might lose your life along with other people. That the world has adopted this universal sign. It means stop. Doesn't mean go, doesn't mean slow, it means stop. A second kind of expression is the symbol. The symbol is much more open to different interpretations. This is a kind of stop too. Like when you're talking to somebody and you do this, right? You're saying stop, but you're not necessarily saying stop coming towards me. You're not necessarily saying stop for the rest of the conversation. It might just be that you're saying stop right now, I want to say something. It's more open to interpretation. So we use signs and symbols to replace spoken messages. And this is what happened when I rented a bicycle in Amsterdam. I was driving it around. When I went to return it, there was an Italian boy in front of me, and he was pushing his bicycle, and he was trying to explain that his bike had a flat tire, but he didn't know enough English. So he says, when he finally got up to the customer service person, he says, my bike is not well. It's not well. That's the only thing he knew how to say, that it was sick. But at the same time, he's doing this with both hands in a very kind of, to me, was in very Italian posture, and laying his hand. He's not doing this. He's doing, lay it. And he showed the bike tire. So he's using signs and he's using symbols to replace that spoken message that, hey, I can't tell you that I have a flat tire, but I'm going to use my nonverbals to help get that across. All right, so the second function now, moving on, is nonverbals are used to send uncomfortable messages. They're used to send uncomfortable messages, like when you're at a dinner. You're at a dinner in a very formal setting. Let's say it's France. France can have some formal settings, can also have some very informal settings. And let's say the mayor of the town is speaking. That's very common. Elected officials in France are not usually elevated up here. They usually mingle along the people. So let's say you're at some kind of special school dinner and the mayor is there, and you're there with some other people from his office, and they're standing on the sides, and he begins to speak. And while he's speaking, or she is speaking, you have two people at a dinner table, and they're whispering and talking, they're kind of laughing like this. And the person comes over, who is one of the persons associated with the mayor's office, and comes over and stands over and does one of these. Okay, you pretty much know what's going on there. It's sending an uncomfortable message. It's a lot better in some ways than coming over and saying, listen, I'm going to have to tell you that you're being very rude right now. You're in a foreign culture, and we expect you to show respect to the man. That would be really, really offensive, probably, to the couple, or at least uncomfortable to them. I mean, you don't know what they were discussing, right? Maybe one of them said, oh my God, I forgot to bring my medicine with me. Did you bring an extra with you? Who knows? Maybe they're talking about something important. So nonverbal communication can also send uncomfortable messages. Also, moving on to a third function now, nonverbal communication helps form impressions that guide communication. So before we even get a chance to speak to somebody, let's say that you're on some street corner in a country that you've never been to. Let's say you're going to Jamaica, right? And you're looking around and you see people that, to you, based on the kinds of people that you grew up with, they look really different from you. People with really long dreadlocks. People wearing the reggae colors, the green and the off-white and that bright red. People singing out loud, singing reggae tunes. People that have a different walk to you. It's a situation where you're looking around and you're trying to get comfort. And now what happens if you need to use the bathroom and you can't see one, so you need to ask somebody? So you're going to start looking around. You're going to start looking around for somebody who, to you, is giving you the impression that they are approachable and that they're not going to harm you, even if your fear of harm is unfounded. And so you look for somebody who's maybe your size. You look for somebody who's maybe older, who would be past the point of being physically able to overcome you. You look for maybe a shopkeeper. You look for somebody who has a look about them, a nonverbal about them, that makes them seem like they're approachable. And so they're forming impressions for you, or you're looking for those impressions from their nonverbal communication. Yet another function is to make relationships clear. To make relationships clear. Just if you saw any of that royal wedding over the weekend, you could see by the way that people were dressed that certain people had a higher standing. I mean, the bride and groom, right? They have the biggest clothes. Certainly the bride has the biggest clothes. I mean, that alone means something. She is the most important person, you could say, by the wedding dress. Not just Meghan Markle, but really any bride. That's why the dress, one of the reasons the dress is so clear. So nobody else is going to be important here, so everybody else must treat the bride like she's a queen for the day. That's making that relationship clear. It's in the case of the bridal dress that we're talking here. In the case of the royal family, we have the bridal dress and the costuming, and also where people are able to sit and who's able to stand and who has to be on the outskirts. These are all ways of making relationships clear. Also, nonverbals can regulate interaction. Nonverbals can regulate interaction. They can dictate the pace of the conversation that's going on. So if you look at, again, two French people speaking on a street corner and you're standing across the street watching them, a lot of times this is what you'll see on the part of one person. You'll see something like this. Okay, I may be exaggerating a little bit there, but the French are very expressive. In fact, when you use the French language, it's a Latin language and it's meant to be expressed. You're on display, you're on show. It's not just communicating, it's that you're also on show. And so when a French person wants to speak while another person is talking, it's no problem for them to talk and tap the person on the shoulder to get them to stop talking so that the next person can speak up. And that is regulating interaction. It's getting them to stop. The same thing that can be said if somebody is you've asked them a question, they're not answering it. You're like, come on, give me the full answer. Why did you take this and not return it? Say more. That's regulating interaction. And finally, as a function of nonverbal communication, we have reinforcing or modifying behavior. So that's where reinforcing or modifying verbal communication, So that's where something is said, but you also emphasize it, okay? So, finally, done the chapter. That says that I feel good. That says that, wow, that was a slog. That says that I'm ready to do something else. It's modifying. In this case, it's reinforcing the behavior. It's taking something that I've said that's clear, and then it's reinforcing that behavior. All right, now let's go on to types of nonverbal communication. And now we can start to look at the way that countries use nonverbal communication differently, or cultures, I should say, within countries, and even various subcultures within our own country. So the first is proxemics. And Edward Hall is one of the chief researchers in the 1970s to talk about proxemics, and he looked at North American cultures, and he actually came up with a very, very concise description of the differences in space that we have depending on whether it's personal space or intimate space or public space and so on. You can look at that chart in the book. The main point is that in different cultures, we use space differently. And even within the United States, we can say if you go to New England, the spaces are much smaller. When you are in public, when you're walking down the street, the spaces are smaller. You go out west, the roads are wider. The distances between the homes are wider. You know, if you're in Las Vegas and you're walking from one casino to the next, it's like a mirage. You think it's right there, especially if you're on the strip. And then you find it's still another 15-minute walk, and it seems like you've only cut in half the distance that you need to get to that casino. So proxemics and the use of space can vary greatly. And in human interaction, we can see that as well. For example, you speak to an Italian in Italy, and they're going to get right up close to you, and they're going to touch you, which is something else that we'll talk about in a few minutes as another type of nonverbal communication. But standing in next to each other is very different. Same with a train ride in England. You're taking a train to London, you're going to be right next to somebody. Same with a subway in New York. But you come into a classroom at college, you go to that seat that's kind of far away from others, and then the next person comes in, chooses their own seat far away, it starts to fill in. We use space differently in the United States and other countries, or we have more of it in many ways. And also within our own country, the West versus the East, and the South versus the North. And now let's go into kinesics. Kinesics is the use of gestures and body movements and facial expressions, which can vary across the world. I mean, we have this okay sign here. Yeah, I hurt myself gardening this weekend. We have the okay sign here, but this is a very offensive and vulgar gesture in Brazil. And in France, this is how they say the number three. Say, how many times? How many times did you take that class? Took it 3 times. That's how they do it in France. So we have vast differences in the way that we express ourselves through kinesics. These are gestures. Gestures. Let's wrap it up. It's body movements, how fast we move. My wife often says that Mexican women have a way of walking down the street. This is part of it. The shoulders go back and forth like this. And it's almost like you can tell that's a Mexican woman by the way that they walk, at least a certain kind of Mexican woman. It's all part of the kinesics and facial expressions as well. Then we come to the third type, which is chronemics. Chronemics, the use of time. And speaking of Mexicans, oh boy, what a different use of time. And really, all countries, the closer you get to the equator, this is a theory that I have, the closer you get to the equator, the more you have that day being equally divided between darkness and light. Because the sun is up 12 hours when you're on the equator, and the sun is down 12 hours when you're on the equator. It never varies. So time is completely predictable the closer you get to the equator. Therefore, those countries that are closer to the equator, they have less of a specific regiment of time than northern countries. They don't pay attention to it as much because they know that that same time is going to come around equally the next day. So if you agree to meet somebody at 1 o'clock for lunch and they don't show up in Mexico, that's not necessarily the case. It's not that they wouldn't show up. They might show up at 3 o'clock because time is so fluid. And what doesn't happen at 1 o'clock can happen at 3 o'clock, because even if it doesn't happen at 3 o'clock, the next day 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock, the exact same ones are going to roll around again. So countries have different paces. Even within the United States, here in the US, we are much faster paced. We're much higher octane, if you want to think of it that way, to use a gasoline metaphor. We're moving around much faster. On the West Coast, they're moving slower. Well, California has that appearance, but I've lived in California. It's not really a slow-paced country. In the South, yeah, it's slower down there for sure. One of the reasons, perhaps, is because it can be so hot. And when it's really, really hot and really, really humid, you move slower. So at any rate, chronemics is the use of time. And then we have paralanguage. Paralanguage is like the tone. It goes along. It's like the vocals. It goes along with the actual words that you are saying. The Canadians, it's one of the funny things that people like to laugh about Canadians, that they end every sentence with "eh." Yeah, it's the way that you play the game, eh? It's always an EH on the end. That's a vocalic that they have to their language. Here in our culture, you'll find many people, including many people in this class probably, when they pause because they don't know what word they want to say, what do? They say, and that's a filler. That's also a vocalic that we have in our languages, not necessarily uttered in other languages. Now we come to another type of nonverbal communication. That's silence. That's just silence. Silence can indicate respect. It can indicate grieving. It can indicate deference. It can indicate astonishment. It can indicate that what is to follow is even more important just by pausing with a moment of silence. Funerals. Funerals is a fairly universal nonverbal to have silence at funerals all across the world. When I was in Ghana, let me tell you, when a village has a funeral, the whole village closes down. No stores open, and everybody is wearing black. The whole place closes down, and you don't hear a pin drop. It's because the whole town is being silent to express its grievance. Grieving, I should say. There's a difference between grievance and grieving. Grieving for the person who passed away. Next up is a type of nonverbal communication. We have haptics. This is touching. Different cultures touch different people different amounts of time. The US is one of the least touching cultures there is in the world, even though you may think that we touch a lot. Whereas if you're in France, as the book said, if you're in a coffee shop, you may get touched 100 times. People touching to make a point. No, 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 listen, touching your elbow, all these kinds of ways of making body contact. Athletes do it all the time. They're sort of set aside for their own rules. I mean, in baseball, a man is, quote, allowed to slap another man's butt as they cross home plate. That haptic, as part of the baseball culture, is allowed. But you don't do that in other scenarios in the United States. All right, next up we have artifactual communication. Artifactual communication is using objects to communicate around the office, like I have over here. Have my beer can collection. If you've been in my office, you've seen that collection. Yeah, these are all beer cans. There's actually a painting that my daughter did. So yeah, I'm actually saying, hey, I want my students to see something my daughter made for me. And then I have these beer cans, and they're from all over England, and I just think they're beautiful little works of art. It's part of the reason that I put them here. Yeah, I think they're like little mini paintings, and that's me saying also to myself in a way, I don't want to forget about my English heritage. I want to see little symbols, little symbols. Yeah, symbols, something can be interpreted many ways, right? So I want to see little symbols of Britain. It reminds me of pubs, those cans. Reminds me of reading newspapers in pubs, which I used to do, which is very common in Britain. So any kind of use of adornment, something that you wear, is an artifact that you're communicating with. In India, gold is a long tradition. And within the Hindu religion, the main religion in India, you have the folklore that Brahma, the god that created the universe, was born from a golden egg. So we have many different manifestations of the use of artifactual communication across cultures, or the use of objects. Next up is territoriality. Territoriality, it's the way that space is used. That's what territories are. You look at the town square. It's a very fundamental feature of almost every European town. You have that square there, you have news agents, you have the railroad station, you have a space where exhibitions go on, you have art exhibits going on, for example. You have street buskers who are there. If you know what they are, they're people who perform magic and tricks and ride around on bicycles and do really unusual things with their bodies. This is the use of the town square. Also in Europe, you find the park is a central aspect. The park where everybody can walk through, a really well-maintained park. A lot of times it's a botanical garden showcasing many different kinds of flowers and spaces, etc. That's the use of space. Here at ESU, we have these red lines that are drawn around each building, each classroom building, saying if you're going to smoke a cigarette, you have to stand outside of that red line. It's all about the use of territoriality. And there's a really interesting use of space that I want to make sure you know about in Sweden. They have a law that's called Allemansratten. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. Allemansratten. It basically means every man's right. It should be every person's right, but it's every man's right. And it means that every single person in Sweden has the right to stay the night on any piece of land anywhere for one night, even somebody else's property. That means you can camp in somebody's backyard, but you can't disturb any of the flowers. You must pack up and leave it exactly as you did the day before, and you can't be within so many feet of the house so that you're actually looking in. So it's really for bigger properties. But what it does is it takes the country and it says that it's not owned by individuals, the country of Sweden. It's owned by everybody, and everybody gets to use it. And if you're going to live on it, you get to use part of it, but you don't own it. That's a really interesting use of territoriality to me. And then finally, we have olfactics, or the use of smell. I talked about Italians a little bit already today, but once again, the kitchen in Italy is always going. There's always some kind of sauce going in the kitchen, filling the house with those aromas of tomatoes and garlic and pesto and olive oil, etc. And here in the United States, we've taken on the idea of aromatherapy as something that can help people overcome illnesses, pain, and mental difficulties that people are having by burning candles, burning incense, burning oils. Even in our houses, we have gadgets that you can plug in into the wall to create a scent that goes around the house. In our cars, we have things that we hang from our mirrors. This is a way of expressing ourselves as well. The Romans were really preoccupied with roses. They just loved the smell of roses. They felt that it created kind of a beautiful flowering feeling in everyday life, and they put those everywhere. All right, so now we come to the part of the chapter where there are two case studies. There's one on Thailand, and it talks about the use of the why, the obedient nonverbal. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't be looking at you because I should be bowing down. You can read about the why and how it takes place, not just in Thailand, by the way, but in most Asian cultures, and the whole purpose of that particular kind of greeting. And you can also check out the second case study, which is it's a dissection of the relationship between Korean Americans and American Americans, and within American Americans, African Americans, particularly within big cities. It talks about some of the misunderstandings that can occur because of the nonverbals by Koreans when African Americans go in to shop at their neighborhood stores. It's very interesting to take a look at that because we find a lot of Korean immigration. We find a lot of Koreans moving into neighborhoods that are adjacent to African Americans. We see that in New York. We can see that in Philadelphia. We can see that in other cities as well. So there you have it. That wraps up this chapter 4 on nonverbal communication. And the only thing I have to say left to you now is